The scream tore through the healer's cottage before dawn had fully broken over the hills. Elena Voss pressed a wet cloth to her own forehead and forced her breathing to slow, to shudder, to sound like something was wrong with her lungs. Outside her window, she could hear her mother's footsteps pounding down the hallway, and she knew the next few minutes would decide everything. "Elena! Elena, what's wrong?" Margaret Voss burst through the door with a candle shaking in her hand, her nightdress still creased from sleep. Elena let her eyes flutter, let her lips part as though each breath cost her something. She had practiced this for 3 nights straight, alone in the dark, whispering the symptoms to herself until they felt like second nature. A wasting fever, weak pulse, cold sweats, trouble breathing. She had read about it in her father's medical journals, the ones he kept locked in his study, the ones she had picked the lock to reach. "Mama," she whispered, letting her voice crack. "I can't. My chest feels like it's caving in." Margaret's face went pale in the candlelight. For one terrible second, Elena almost called it off. Almost sat up and confessed everything. But then she thought of the announcement that had come 3 days earlier, carried by a rider in the King's colors, nailed to the door of every pack house in the region. The Alpha King's selection. Every eligible woman of the packs, presented before the throne, judged, ranked, chosen, or discarded like cattle at a market. She thought of the other girls from neighboring packs who had come home from selections in years past, some married off within a week to men they had spoken to only once, some sent home in shame with their names attached to whispers that never quite faded. She thought of the freedom she had built for herself here, tending herbs with her father, learning the names of every plant on the mountain, belonging to no one but herself. She could not go. She would not go. "I'll fetch your father," Margaret said, already turning toward the door, panic sharpening her voice, into something Elena had never heard before. "No, wait." Elena caught her mother's wrist. For just a moment, the two women looked at each other, and something passed between them that needed no words. Margaret had married young, chosen not for love but for convenience, moved 3 villages from her own mother the week after her 18th birthday. She understood, better than anyone, what waited for a girl who caught the wrong eye at the wrong ceremony. "Please," Elena whispered. "Just this once. Let it look real. I'm begging you." Margaret's jaw tightened. She set the candle down on the bedside table, and when she spoke again, her voice had steadied into something practical, something conspiratorial. "Cold water on the cloth, not warm. It needs to look like a fever-breaking sweat, not a girl playing at being sick." She reached for the basin. "Your father will ask questions. Let me speak to him first." Relief flooded through Elena so fast it made her dizzy for real. She sank back against the pillows and let her mother work, dabbing her temples, tousling her hair into disarray, pinching just enough color from her cheeks to leave them blotchy rather than rosy. It was, Elena thought distantly, the most elaborate lie the Voss household had ever told. By mid-morning, the entire pack had heard that the healer's daughter had taken ill in the night. Neighbors came to the door with offerings of broth and dried herbs, murmuring sympathy, peering past Margaret's shoulder for a glimpse of the girl who was too sick to be seen. Elena stayed in bed the whole day, drifting in and out of a performance so convincing that by evening, even she had begun to feel the fatigue of it settle into her bones. Her father, Edward Voss, was harder to fool. He was a healer by trade, had spent 30 years learning to read a body's true condition beneath whatever mask it wore. And when he sat at her bedside that evening and pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point in her wrist, Elena held her breath and prayed her nerves would not betray her. "Steady," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He frowned, checked again, held a hand near her forehead without quite touching it. No true fever. His eyes flicked to hers, sharp and searching in the lamplight. "Elena." "Papa, I don't feel well," she said quickly, injecting a tremor into her voice. He studied her for a long moment. Elena could see the calculations behind his eyes, the healer's instinct warring with something else, something that looked almost like understanding. Edward Voss had 2 daughters, and had buried a sister of his own, to a marriage arranged before she was old enough to understand what marriage meant. He knew what the selection could do to a girl who did not want to be found. "The selection notice came yesterday," he said quietly. It was not a question. Elena said nothing. Her silence was answer enough. Edward exhaled slowly through his nose, the way he always did when weighing a difficult decision. when deciding how much medicine to give a patient whose body could not be trusted to tell the whole truth. Finally, he reached for his satchel and withdrew a small vial of herbs, the same ones he used to induce a mild sweat in patients recovering from chills. He held it up so she could see it clearly. "If your mother and I are going to help you with this," he said, low and steady, "you will do exactly as I say, and you will not enjoy the taste of what I'm about to give you. It will make you look sick without making you sick. Do you understand?" Elena's throat tightened with something between gratitude and disbelief. "You'll help me?" "I raised you to think for yourself," Edward said, uncorking the vial. "I am not about to hand you over to a stranger's court, because a piece of paper says I must." He paused, his expression darkening with something like worry. "But Elena, hear me. Kings do not like to be defied, even quietly. If this is discovered, the consequences will not fall only on you. Do you still want this?" She thought of the selection hall she had heard described, the long aisle, the rows of watching eyes, the throne at the end, where a man she had never met would look at her like livestock. She thought of the freedom of her mountain, her herbs, her books, her own choices. "Yes," she said, and meant it with every part of her. The following days passed in a careful, exhausting ritual. Elena drank her father's bitter tonics each morning, to keep her pulse elevated and her skin pale. She stayed in her darkened room, curtains drawn, refusing visitors, letting the rumor of her illness spread through the pack like smoke through dry grass. Word reached the pack elders within the week, and from there, a formal letter was drafted and sent to the capital, explaining that the Voss family's eligible daughter had taken gravely ill and would be unable to attend the selection ceremony. Elena watched her father seal the letter with wax and hand it to the writer from the window of her room, her heart hammering with something dangerously close to hope. If the letter was accepted without question, this would all be over. She could return to her life, her herbs, her small quiet freedoms, and the Alpha King would never know her name at all. But hope, Elena would learn, was a fragile thing, in a kingdom ruled by wolves who could smell a lie from across a room. 3 days after the letter was sent, a different kind of visitor arrived at the edge of the Voss lands. Not a rider in the king's colors, not a formal envoy with a wax-sealed reply, but a lone figure on horseback, who moved through the trees with a silence that made the birds stop singing. Nora, the young woman who helped Margaret with the herb garden, was the first to see him from the fence line, and she came running to the cottage with her apron still dusted in soil, breathless and wide-eyed. "Mrs. Voss," she gasped, bursting through the kitchen door. "There's a man at the gate. He didn't ask to come in." "He's just standing there, looking at the house." Margaret's hands stilled over the bread she was kneading. "What does he look like?" "Tall, dark hair. He's got a way about him that made my skin go cold, and I couldn't tell you why." Nora swallowed hard. "Mrs. Voss, I think it might be him. I think it might be the king." The flour bowl slipped from Margaret's hands and shattered against the stone floor. Upstairs, Elena heard the crash through her half-open door, and something in her chest went very still, the way the forest goes still, right before a storm breaks. She had not expected the king himself to come. She had expected a letter of confirmation, a courier's polite acceptance, perhaps a physician sent to verify her condition from a respectful distance. She had never imagined that the ruler of an entire kingdom would ride to a healer's cottage on the edge of nowhere to see for himself. She sat up in bed, pulse hammering now for reasons that had nothing to do with her father's tonics, and strained to hear the voices rising from the yard below. Her mother's voice, thin with nerves. A stranger's voice in reply, low, unhurried, carrying an authority that seemed to settle over the whole property like a weight pressing down on the air itself. She could not make out the words, only the tone, and the tone alone was enough to make her stomach drop. Footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate. Not her mother's familiar hurried tread, but something heavier, something that seemed to know exactly how much space it was allowed to take up in the world. Elena had just enough time to lie back against the pillows, arrange her face into the practiced mask of illness, and press the damp cloth to her forehead before the door swung open. She had imagined the Alpha King 100 different ways in the days since the selection notice arrived. Cruel, indifferent, bored with his own power. She had not imagined the man who now stood framed in her bedroom doorway, broad-shouldered and dark-eyed, filling the small space with a presence that made the air feel thinner. He did not look bored. He did not look cruel exactly, though there was something unreadable and dangerous beneath the calm of his expression, something that made her instinctively want to shrink beneath the blankets and disappear. He simply looked at her, his gaze moving slowly from her face, to the damp cloth in her hand, to the shallow, practiced rise and fall of her chest, and Elena felt, with sudden and sickening clarity, that every performance she had ever given in her life was about to fail her for the very first time. "Leave us," he said quietly, not to her, but to the hallway behind him, and Elena heard her mother's footsteps retreat, reluctant and frightened, down the stairs. Then the king of the realm crossed the room, pulled the wooden chair from beside her writing desk, and sat down at her bedside, as though he had all the time in the world. "I hear you're very sick," he said. Elena opened her mouth to answer, and found, for the first time in days, that she had absolutely no idea what to say. "I said I don't feel well," Elena managed, her voice thinner than she wanted it to be. "My chest. It's tight. I can barely breathe some mornings." The king studied her without blinking, and Elena had the strange, dizzying sensation of being weighed on a scale she could not see. His eyes were a deep, unsettling shade of brown that seemed to catch the lamplight and hold it, and there was something in the set of his jaw that told her he was not a man who wasted words. He had not introduced himself. He had not needed to. Every line of him, from the way he filled the doorway to the quiet authority in his voice, announced exactly who he was. "Damien Ashgrave," he said finally, as though reading her thoughts. "Since your household seems too frightened to say it aloud." "I know who you are," Elena whispered. "Good, then you'll understand why I find it strange that a letter arrived at my court claiming a young woman was too ill to travel, and yet when I rode 2 full days out of my way to see for myself, I find her sitting up, speaking in full sentences, with color in her cheeks that owes more to pinching than to fever." His tone remained calm, almost gentle, which somehow made the words land harder than if he had shouted them. "Tell me, Miss Voss, are you truly ill?" Elena's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it. She thought of every excuse her father had prepared her with, every symptom she had rehearsed in the dark, and found that none of them would come. Something about the way he looked at her made lying feel suddenly, dangerously impossible, as though the words would simply refuse to leave her mouth. "I told you," she said instead, choosing stubbornness over confession. "I don't feel well." A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something close to amusement. "You're a poor liar," he said. "Your pulse is racing, but not from fever. Your breath is quick, but not from illness, and you have not once, in this entire conversation, actually coughed." He tilted his head slightly. "A girl faking a wasting fever should cough. It's the first thing anyone would notice missing." Elena stared at him, humiliation and panic rising together in her throat like bile. She had spent days perfecting the pallor of her skin, the tremor in her hands, the practiced weakness in her voice, and she had forgotten something so basic, so obvious, that a man who had known her for less than 5 minutes had caught it instantly. "Perhaps I don't have that kind of fever," she said, grasping for anything. "Perhaps," he agreed, in a tone that made it clear he believed nothing of the sort. He leaned back slightly in the chair, folding his arms, and for a long moment simply looked at her, the way a man might look at a puzzle he had already half solved but wanted to watch unfold anyway. "Do you know how many letters like yours arrive at my court every season, Miss Voss? Sudden illnesses, family emergencies, betrothals discovered at the last possible moment. Girls across this kingdom have become remarkably creative in their attempts to avoid my selection." "Then perhaps you should ask yourself why," Elena said before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted the sharpness in her voice. She had not meant to sound so bold. Not to a king, not to the man who could have her entire pack punished with a single word. But something about his calm, almost bemused observation of her deception had lit a small, reckless fire in her chest. To her surprise, he did not look offended. If anything, something flickered in his expression that looked almost like interest. "Go on," he said. "Tell me why." Elena hesitated, aware that she was standing, sitting, at the edge of something she could not take back. But the words had already begun to climb her throat, and there seemed little point in stopping them now that her ruse had failed so completely. "Because it isn't a choosing," she said. "Not really. It's a parade. Women stood in rows to be looked at, judged by a stranger who knows nothing about them beyond how they curtsy or how prettily they smile. And whoever isn't chosen goes home marked, whispered about, treated as though something is wrong with her for the rest of her life. And whoever is chosen doesn't get a choice either. She simply becomes whatever the crown decides she should be. Her voice shook, but she pressed on. I didn't fake an illness because I'm frightened of you, Your Majesty. I faked it because I refused to be handed to anyone, king or otherwise, as though I were a basket of goods to be picked over at a market stall. Silence fell over the small room. Elena's pulse roared in her ears, and she waited, braced, for the anger she was certain would follow such insolence. Kings did not appreciate being told the truth about themselves, especially not by healers' daughters lying in beds they did not truly need. But Damien Ashgrave did not raise his voice. He did not summon guards, did not threaten her family, did not do any of the things Elena had feared in the days since the selection notice first arrived. Instead, he simply watched her with an expression she could not quite name, something between surprise and reluctant respect, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. You're the first person who has said that to my face in 11 years of ruling, he said quietly. Elena blinked, thrown by the sudden shift. That seems unlikely. It is entirely likely, he said. Most people who disagree with the selection do so in whispers behind closed doors, never within earshot of anyone who might repeat it to me. You, apparently, prefer to say it directly to my face while pretending to be dying of a fever you clearly do not have. There was something almost wry in his tone now, though his eyes remained sharp, assessing. It's an unusual combination of cowardice and courage, Miss Voss. I confess, I don't quite know what to make of it. Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, watching him warily as he rose from the chair and moved toward the window, looking out at the herb garden below, where her mother had likely been standing only minutes before, listening to every word through the thin cottage walls. I could have you and your family punished for this, he said, still facing the window. It was not a threat exactly. His tone remained level, almost thoughtful, but the words landed with the weight of truth all the same. Deceiving the crown is no small matter. There are laws, precedents. My council would expect nothing less than a formal reprimand, perhaps worse, depending on how loudly this story travels. Elena's stomach twisted with fear, not for herself but for her parents, for Nora, for the entire pack that had helped shelter her lie without fully understanding what it might cost them. Please, she said quickly, all her earlier defiance draining into something closer to desperation. It was my idea, mine alone. My family only helped because they love me. If punishment must fall on someone, let it fall on me. Damien turned from the window to look at her, and something in his expression shifted again, softened at the edges, in a way that confused her more than his earlier sharpness had. I did not say I intended to punish anyone, he said. I said I could. Then what do you intend? Elena asked, hardly daring to breathe. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way he had when he first entered the room, as though trying to solve something that refused to be solved easily. Outside, a bird began to sing in the branches above the cottage, an ordinary sound that felt strangely out of place against the tension coiled tight between them. I intend to ask you a question, he said finally, and I would like an honest answer this time, if you're capable of one. He walked back toward the bed and stood at the foot of it, arms folded, his gaze steady and unblinking. If I withdrew your name from the selection right now, today, with no punishment to you or your family, would you thank me for it, or would you resent me for pitying you? The question caught Elena completely off guard. She had expected threats, or perhaps a cold command that she attend the selection despite everything, dragged there in disgrace if necessary. She had not expected to be asked what she actually wanted, not by a king, not by anyone who held real power over her fate. I don't know, she admitted slowly, because it was, for once, entirely true. I would be relieved, but I don't think I would want it to be pity. I don't want anyone's pity, least of all a king's. Something in his expression shifted again, approval perhaps, or simple curiosity deepening into something more. Then it will not be pity, he said. Consider it something else instead. Call it curiosity, if you prefer a gentler word. Elena frowned, sitting up straighter despite the ache the movement caused in muscles tired from days of feigned weakness. Curiosity about what? But Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the door, pausing with one hand on the frame, and looked back at her, with an expression that would stay lodged in her memory for weeks afterward, half amusement and half something far more serious beneath it. About whether a girl brave enough to lie to a king's face might one day be brave enough to tell him the truth, he said. I'll be speaking with your father before I leave. Rest, Miss Voss. Or don't. I think we both know now that resting was never truly the problem. And then he was gone, his footsteps descending the stairs with the same unhurried, deliberate rhythm they had carried on the way up, leaving Elena alone in her room, with her heart pounding, her carefully constructed illness in ruins around her, and a question echoing in her mind that she had no idea how to begin answering. Downstairs, she could hear voices again, her father's low and careful, the king's steady and unreadable, and she strained to catch fragments of the conversation drifting up through the floorboards. She caught only pieces, something about formalities, something about discretion, something about a decision that would be made, though what that decision was, she could not tell. When the front door finally opened and closed, and the sound of hoofbeats faded slowly into the distance, Elena finally allowed herself to breathe. She sank back against her pillows, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of the conversation in her mind, searching for some clue to what had just happened, what it meant, what would come next. She did not know, not yet, that the king of the realm had ridden away from her cottage that afternoon, having already made up his mind about something far more significant than punishment. She did not know that her name, instead of being quietly withdrawn from the selection records as she had hoped, was about to become the most talked-about mystery in his court, and she certainly did not know that this would not be the last time Damien Ashgrave appeared, unannounced and unbothered by propriety, at the edge of her family's land. For now, she only knew that her carefully built lie had crumbled in less than 10 minutes, that a king had looked at her with something far more unsettling than anger, and that somewhere deep beneath her relief, a small and frightening curiosity of her own had begun to stir. By the time the sun set that evening, half the pack already knew the king had visited the Voss cottage, and by the following morning, the other half knew it too, along with a dozen different versions of what had supposedly been said behind that closed bedroom door. Elena sat at the kitchen table, picking at a bowl of porridge she had no appetite for, while her mother moved restlessly between the hearth and the window, unable to settle. Edward had not slept at all. He sat across from Elena now, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion, a folded letter resting on the table between them, that had arrived by courier at first light. "Read it again," Margaret said, though she had already heard it twice. Edward unfolded the parchment carefully, as though it might tear if handled too roughly, and read aloud in a voice still hoarse with disbelief. "By order of the Crown, the name of Elena Voss is formally withdrawn from the roll of selection candidates, effective immediately, on the grounds of a private matter reviewed and resolved at the discretion of His Majesty King Damien Ashgrave. No further action shall be taken against the Voss household." Silence settled over the kitchen. Elena stared at the letter as though it might change its meaning if she looked at it long enough. She had gotten what she wanted. Exactly what she wanted, in fact. More cleanly and completely than she had dared to hope for, even in her most optimistic moments of planning. Her name was gone from the selection. No punishment, no shame attached to her family's name. And yet the relief she had expected to feel refused to fully arrive, crowded out instead by a strange, nagging unease she could not quite name. "A private matter reviewed and resolved," Margaret repeated slowly. "What does that even mean?" "It means," Edward said, setting the letter down with visible care, "that the king has chosen to protect Elena's name, rather than expose her deception. And I do not yet understand why a man with no obligation to any of us would do such a thing." He looked at his daughter carefully, the way he might study a patient whose symptoms did not quite match any illness he recognized. "Elena, what exactly did he say to you?" Elena hesitated, turning the memory over in her mind. The calm assessment of her failed performance, the sharp question about pity, the strange parting words about bravery and truth that she still did not fully understand. She was not certain how to explain any of it in a way that made sense, mostly because she had spent half the night trying to make sense of it herself, and had failed entirely. "He asked if I would resent being helped out of pity," she said finally. "I told him I didn't know, and then he left." Her parents exchanged a look Elena couldn't quite read, one of those silent conversations between two people who had been married long enough to communicate entirely without words. Whatever passed between them, neither chose to voice it aloud, though Margaret's hands twisted anxiously in her apron for the rest of the morning. Word of the king's private visit and the sudden, mysterious withdrawal of Elena's name spread through the pack with the speed of wildfire through dry brush. By midday, neighbors who had never spoken more than a passing greeting to the Voss family were finding excuses to walk past their fence line, peering toward the cottage with open curiosity. By evening, the whispers had traveled well beyond the borders of their own pack, carried by traders and travelers to neighboring territories, growing more elaborate with every retelling. Some said the king had fallen instantly in love with the healer's daughter and intended to make her his queen without the formality of a selection at all. Others said she had cursed him somehow, bewitched him with forbidden herbs from her father's garden, and that the withdrawal was some kind of trap. A few, less kindly, suggested that Elena had bought her freedom through means no respectable woman would ever admit to, and though Elena knew none of it to be true, the rumors stung all the same, crawling under her skin like burrs caught in wool. "Ignore them," Nora advised one afternoon, as the two of them worked side by side in the garden, pulling weeds from between rows of feverfew and chamomile. "People will always fill silence with whatever story frightens or excites them most. You know the truth. That's what matters." "The truth is strange enough on its own," Elena admitted, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron. "I don't need anyone inventing stranger versions of it." Nora glanced sideways at her, a knowing look in her eyes. "You keep saying it was strange. What was strange about it exactly?" "A king catching a lie and letting it go free doesn't sound so unusual to me. Not if he's the sort of man who values honesty more than pride." "It's not that he let it go," Elena said slowly, trying to put words to something she had been circling in her own mind for days. "It's the way he asked about it, like my answer actually mattered to him, like he wanted to know what I thought, not just what I'd done." She shook her head, frustrated with her own inability to explain it properly, even to herself. Kings aren't supposed to care what healers' daughters think about anything. "Maybe this one does," Nora said simply, and returned to her weeding, leaving Elena with a thought that unsettled her far more than she wanted to admit. Meanwhile, in the capital, the effects of that single quiet visit had begun to ripple through the king's court, in ways far more consequential than village gossip. Damien's decision to personally withdraw a candidate's name, rather than simply accepting or rejecting the illness claim through official channels as he always had before, did not go unnoticed by the men and women who served closest to the throne. Oliver Kane, the king's oldest friend and most trusted advisor, found Damien in his private study late that same evening, staring into the fireplace with an expression Oliver had rarely seen on him before. Distracted, distant, entirely unlike the sharp, controlled focus that usually governed every hour of the king's day. "You rode 2 days to check on a fever," Oliver said, settling into the chair across from him without invitation, as old friends were permitted to do. "And you came back having personally dismissed her from the selection, rather than sending her home in disgrace, which is what happens to every other girl who tries that particular excuse. I'm curious what happened in that room, Damien, because whatever it was has put a look on your face I haven't seen since before your father died." Damien did not look away from the fire. "She lied to my face, and then told me exactly why she'd done it, without flinching, without apologizing for it," he said. "Do you know how many people in this court have looked me in the eye and told me the truth about what they actually think of my selection, my rule, any of it?" "None," Oliver said, "because most people value keeping their heads attached to their shoulders." "Precisely," Damien said, "and she said it anyway, believing I could ruin her entire family for it." He finally turned from the fire, and Oliver was startled by the intensity in his friend's expression, something sharpened and thoughtful that had not been there in years. "I have sat through countless selections, Oliver. I have looked at hundreds of women arranged like ornaments in a hall, each one performing whatever version of herself she believes I want to see. Not one of them has ever once shown me anything real. And then I ride out to check on a supposed fever, and find a girl too stubborn to even pretend at courtesy, entirely unwilling to soften the truth for my benefit." Oliver studied him carefully. "You're not planning to simply leave it there, are you?" It was not really a question, and Damien did not treat it as one. "No," he admitted quietly. "I don't think I am." "The council will not be pleased," Oliver warned. "You've already withdrawn one candidate, under unusual circumstances. If word spreads that you're taking a personal interest in a girl outside the formal selection process, there will be pressure, questions about favoritism, about the legitimacy of the whole ceremony, about whether the other pack's daughters were ever given a fair chance at all. "I'm aware," Damien said, "and William Draven will use it against you the moment he catches wind of it," Oliver added, watching his friend's expression carefully for a reaction. "You know how he's been circling since the border disputes began. He's been waiting for any excuse to paint you as unfit to lead a unified kingdom. And a king who abandons his own selection for a healer's daughter from an unranked pack is exactly the kind of story that could hand him the excuse he needs." Damien's jaw tightened at the mention of Draven's name, a muscle ticking faintly beneath the surface of his composed expression. William Draven, Alpha of the Northern Territories, had spent the better part of 2 years quietly building alliances among the more traditional pack elders, men and women who resented the unification Damien's father had forced upon their fractured lands a generation earlier. A misstep now, however small it might seem, could hand Draven exactly the leverage he had been hunting for. "Then I will simply have to be careful," Damien said finally, rising from his chair and moving back toward the window, looking out over the torchlit courtyard below. "But careful does not mean absent, Oliver. I have spent 11 years giving this kingdom everything it required of me, including a selection process I have never once believed in. I think I am allowed, just this once, to follow something that feels more honest than duty." Oliver said nothing further, though the worry lingering in his eyes suggested he had many more objections he had chosen, for the moment, to keep to himself. He understood his friend well enough to know that once Damien Ashgrave had decided on a course, there was very little anyone could say to turn him from it, and something told him this particular course had already been set the moment the king walked into that healer's cottage and found a girl too stubborn to lie convincingly, even to save herself. Back on the mountain, Elena had no knowledge of the conversation unfolding in the capital, no idea that her name was already being weighed and debated by men whose decisions could shape the fate of entire territories. She only knew that 3 days after the king's visit, as she stood in the garden with dirt beneath her fingernails and a basket of dried lavender balanced on her hip, she looked up toward the tree line at the edge of the property and felt, with sudden and inexplicable certainty, that she was being watched. She scanned the trees carefully, her heart beginning to quicken, but saw nothing. No horse, no rider, no sign of anyone at all, and yet the feeling lingered, settling over her like a shadow that refused to lift, and for reasons she could not fully explain, Elena found herself wondering whether this strange, unsettling chapter of her life was truly finished after all, or whether it had only just begun. The horn sounded across the valley before Elena had even finished tying her boots, sharp and urgent, the kind of signal the pack reserved only for danger or for visitors of significant rank, and her stomach dropped the instant she heard it. She rushed to the window in time to see a small procession winding up the mountain road, not the single rider from before, but a proper retinue this time, banners snapping in the wind, a handful of mounted guards flanking a figure at the center whose bearing she recognized instantly, even from this distance. Her pulse quickened in a way that had nothing to do with any tonic her father had ever prepared. "He's come again," Nora said from the doorway, breathless from having run the length of the garden to deliver the news. "And this time he's brought half his court with him." Elena's first instinct was panic, sharp and immediate, but it was quickly replaced by confusion, because nothing about this visit matched the quiet, private nature of the last one. Word had apparently reached the surrounding villages that the king intended to inspect the northern border markers that ran along the edge of the Voss Pack's territory, a routine matter of security that any Alpha King might reasonably attend to in person. And yet Elena could not shake the growing certainty, as she watched the procession draw closer, that the border inspection was little more than a convenient excuse. By the time the king's party reached the village square, half the pack had gathered to watch, murmuring excitedly amongst themselves, and Elena found herself pulled along by her mother's firm hand, dressed hastily in her best dress, positioned near the front of the crowd whether she wished to be there or not. Damien dismounted with the same unhurried authority she remembered from their first meeting, exchanging brief, formal words with the pack elders who rushed forward to greet him, his expression carefully composed into something appropriately regal and distant. For a long moment his gaze moved across the assembled crowd without pausing, and Elena allowed herself to hope, foolishly, that perhaps this visit truly had nothing to do with her at all. Then his eyes found hers, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of recognition that lasted barely a heartbeat, before he composed himself again, and returned his attention to the elders speaking before him. The formal portion of the visit lasted the better part of an hour. Inspection of the border markers, discussion of recent wolf sightings from rival territories, polite exchanges with the pack leadership that Elena watched from a respectful distance, half listening, half simply trying to steady her own racing thoughts. It was only as the visit began winding toward its natural conclusion, as guards began preparing the horses for departure, that Damien excused himself from the elders with a brief word and crossed the square directly toward her. The crowd around Elena seemed to part instinctively, murmurs rising like a tide at his approach, and she felt her face flush with the weight of dozens of curious eyes settling on her at once. "Miss Voss," Damien said, his tone perfectly polite, perfectly appropriate for the public setting, though something warmer flickered beneath the formality. "I hope your health has improved since my last visit." There was something almost teasing in the way he said it, a private acknowledgement of their shared secret, hidden inside words, that would sound entirely innocent to anyone listening. Elena felt a startled laugh nearly escape her before she managed to suppress it, biting the inside of her cheek to keep her expression composed. "Considerably, Your Majesty," she said carefully. "The fresh air seems to have done wonders." Something that might have been amusement flickered at the corner of his mouth. "I'm glad to hear it. Perhaps you might walk with me to the border markers. I understand your father's garden supplies half the healing herbs used along this region, and I find myself curious about the plants that grow this far north." It was, Elena understood immediately, an excuse. A thin, transparent excuse that fooled absolutely no one watching, least of all her own mother, who stood nearby with an expression caught somewhere between pride and alarm. But refusing a king's request in front of his own guards and half the pack was not something even Elena's stubbornness could manage, so she found herself falling into step beside him as they walked toward the tree line, leaving the murmuring crowd behind. For a while, neither of them spoke. The path wound gently upward through birch and pine, the kind of quiet, ordinary trail Elena had walked 1,000 times in her life, and yet everything about it felt strange and unfamiliar with the king of the realm walking silently at her side. "You didn't come here for border markers," she said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. "No," he admitted, without hesitation or apology, "though the markers do need inspecting, and I've combined a genuine duty with a less official one. I find that efficiency tends to satisfy my counsel, far more than honesty about my motives would." Elena glanced at him sideways. "And what exactly is the less official motive, if I may ask?" Damien was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, and when he finally answered, his voice had lost some of its earlier ease, replaced by something more careful, more deliberate. "I told you once that I was curious about you," he said. "That curiosity has not faded in the time since. If anything, it has grown more difficult to ignore." Elena's heart stumbled over itself, and she was grateful for the uneven ground, which gave her an excuse to look down and hide whatever expression had crossed her face. "That seems like a great deal of effort for simple curiosity, Your Majesty. 2 visits in less than a month, an official border inspection that just happens to bring you to my family's doorstep." "Perhaps it isn't so simple then," Damien said, and something in his tone made Elena's breath catch. "I have spent 11 years being told exactly what people believe I want to hear. Elders flatter me. Candidates perform for me. Even my own counsel chooses its words with careful calculation, weighing every sentence against how it might affect their own standing. You are the only person who has spoken to me in years without any of that calculation, and I find I would very much like to understand why." Elena stopped walking, turning to face him fully, her earlier nervousness giving way to something steadier, more direct. "Perhaps it's simply because I never expected to matter to you," she said. "There was nothing to gain from flattering a king I assumed I would never see again. It's easy to be honest with someone when you believe the stakes are low." "And now?" Damien asked, watching her carefully. "Now that you know the stakes are considerably higher than you first believed, will the honesty disappear along with the low stakes?" It was a fair question, and Elena considered it seriously before answering, aware that whatever she said next would shape whatever strange, uncertain thing was forming between them. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never had much practice being honest with someone whose opinion could reshape my entire life, but I think I would rather try and fail at honesty than succeed at flattery. It seems a poor trade, even for a king's favor." Something shifted in Damien's expression at that, something warm and unguarded that Elena had not yet seen from him, a genuine smile, rather than the careful, measured amusement he had shown before. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely the answer I hoped for, and did not expect to receive." They resumed walking, the conversation drifting into easier territory, the herbs growing along the trail, the history of the packlands, small ordinary things that felt strangely significant given who was asking about them. Elena found herself relaxing by degrees, surprised by how easily conversation seemed to flow once the initial tension eased, surprised by the dry humor hidden beneath Damien's careful formality, surprised most of all by how quickly an hour passed without either of them noticing. It was only as they neared the border markers, the true official purpose of the visit finally in sight, that Damien slowed his pace and glanced at her with an expression that had turned suddenly more serious. "I should warn you," he said, "that visits like this one will not go unnoticed by my court, no matter how carefully I disguise them as official business. There are those who will look for reasons to turn any attention I pay you into a weapon, either against you or against me. I would understand, if you preferred I stopped coming, for your own safety as much as mine." Elena considered this carefully, weighing the fear that flickered instinctively at his words against something else entirely. Something that had been growing steadily since the moment he first sat at her bedside and asked her a question no one had ever bothered asking before. "I faked an illness to avoid becoming a stranger's obligation," she said slowly. "I don't think I want to trade that fear for a different one, hiding from whatever your court might say about a friendship I've chosen for myself." She met his gaze directly, steadying her voice despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Keep coming, if you'd like to. I think I would like that too." Damien's expression softened into something Elena would spend the following weeks trying, and failing, to fully name, and for a moment, standing among the border markers with the whole weight of the kingdom's expectations pressing in from every direction. It felt almost possible to imagine that this strange, unlikely connection might survive whatever came next. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line further down the ridge, a young woman in fine traveling clothes, her expression sharp with calculation, as she observed the king's private conversation with a healer's daughter from an unranked pack, filing away every detail with the careful precision of someone already planning exactly how to use it. Charlotte Fenwick had ridden 3 days from her father's estate to attend the selection, certain that her lineage, her beauty, and her family's careful cultivation of court connections would be more than enough to secure her a place among the king's final candidates. What she had not expected, upon arriving early to survey the northern territories her father hoped she might one day govern as queen, was to witness the king himself walking a quiet forest trail with a woman who was not even on the selection roll. She watched the two of them from the ridge for nearly 20 minutes, close enough to catch fragments of laughter carried on the wind, but too far to hear actual words. And by the time she finally turned her horse back toward the guest lodgings where her family waited, her mind had already constructed an entire narrative around what she'd seen, one considerably darker and more scandalous than the truth, though Charlotte found she did not particularly care about accuracy, so long as the story served her purposes. "You're certain it was him?" her father asked that evening, pacing the length of their borrowed sitting room, while Charlotte sat calmly by the fire, turning the information over in her mind, like a jeweler examining a stone for flaws. "Certain," Charlotte said, and it was more than a passing conversation. He looked at her the way men look at women they've already decided matter to them. She smiled thinly. "The pack girl who faked her illness. I heard the rumors on the road here. Apparently the king rode out personally to verify her condition, and then withdrew her name himself. No formal review, no explanation offered to the council." Her father's pacing slowed. Lord Fenwick had spent decades navigating the delicate politics of court alliances, and he recognized opportunity when it presented itself as clearly as this. If the king is showing favor to a woman outside the selection process entirely, that calls into question the legitimacy of the entire ceremony, he said slowly. Every family that has spent a fortune preparing daughters for this event would have grounds to be furious, should such a thing become widely known. Furious enough to demand answers, Charlotte agreed. Furious enough, perhaps, to look elsewhere for leadership that respects tradition rather than personal whims. She did not need to say Draven's name aloud. Both of them understood the implication clearly enough. and the Northern Alpha's growing network of discontented allies had been quietly gathering support for exactly this kind of opportunity for the better part of 2 years. "We should be careful how we use this," her father cautioned. "Accuse the king directly, and we risk being branded troublemakers before we've even secured your place among the candidates. Better to let the story travel on its own, seated carefully among the right ears, until the pressure builds naturally, without our fingerprints anywhere on it." Charlotte nodded slowly, already turning the plan over in her mind, refining it, sharpening its edges. She had not traveled 3 days, and invested considerable family resources into this selection, only to be overshadowed by an unranked healer's daughter, who hadn't even bothered to properly compete. If Elena Voss wanted the king's attention badly enough to earn it through deception and quiet forest walks, then Charlotte intended to make certain that attention came at the highest possible cost. Unaware of the storm quietly gathering in the guest lodgings across the valley, Elena spent the following weeks in a strange, suspended kind of happiness she had never before experienced, one she found herself reluctant to examine too closely, for fear of somehow disturbing it. Damien's visits continued, though never with the same frequency or predictability twice. Sometimes a formal escort arriving with proper notice, sometimes a single rider slipping quietly through the tree line at dusk, always accompanied by some plausible official reason that satisfied his counsel, even as it fooled absolutely no one who actually witnessed the visits themselves. They walked the mountain trails together, discussing everything from the medicinal properties of mountain herbs to the weight of ruling a kingdom still fractured beneath its unified surface. Elena learned that Damien had lost his own mother young, raised largely by tutors and advisors who had trained him for power, long before he was old enough to understand what that power would cost him. Damien learned that Elena had spent her childhood nursing injured animals back to health in secret, unable to bear watching anything suffer without trying to help, a trait her father teasingly blamed for her stubborn refusal to accept any fate she found unjust. "You would have made a fine healer even without the selection interrupting things," Damien observed one afternoon, as they sat together on a fallen log overlooking the valley, the autumn light turning the surrounding trees gold and amber. "I intend to be one regardless," Elena said. "Selection or no selection, king's attention or no king's attention. I've spent my whole life learning this work. I'm not prepared to set it aside simply because a crown has taken an interest in me." Something flickered across Damien's face at that, thoughtful and slightly troubled. "Would you have to set it aside?" he asked, "if things between us continued to develop as they have been." Elena considered the question seriously, aware of the weight behind it. Aware that they had finally arrived at a conversation neither of them had been quite ready to have until now. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never met a queen who was also a healer. I'm not certain the two roles are meant to exist in the same life. Perhaps they've simply never had reason to before," Damien said quietly. "I don't intend to build a life with someone only to demand she abandon everything that makes her who she is. If that's what the crown requires, then perhaps the crown requires reconsidering, not you." Elena looked at him then, really looked, searching his expression for any sign of flattery or performance, the kind of empty promise powerful men sometimes offered women they wished to please. She found none, only a quiet, steady sincerity that unsettled her far more than any grand romantic declaration could have, precisely because it felt so entirely genuine. "You say things like that so easily," she said softly, as though reshaping centuries of tradition were a simple matter. "Nothing about this has been simple," Damien said, his voice low. "Not since the moment I walked into your bedroom and found a girl too stubborn to properly fake her own illness. I have spent 11 years accepting that duty, and desire rarely occupy the same space in a king's life. I find myself considerably less willing to accept that now." The weight of his words settled between them, heavy and significant, and for a long moment neither spoke, the only sound the wind moving through the golden leaves overhead. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, some careful wall she had built without fully realizing it, constructed brick by brick out of every fear she carried about losing herself to someone else's expectations. "I'm frightened," she admitted finally, the words costing her more than she expected. "Not of you, of everything around you. The council, the court, the rumors already spreading about a pack girl who caught a king's eye through deception rather than merit. I don't know how to survive in a world built on performance, when the only thing I've ever been good at is honesty." Damien reached over, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and took her hand in his grip warm and steady, despite the uncertainty of the moment. "Then we'll learn how to build something different together," he said. "I'm not asking you to become someone suited for that world as it currently exists. I'm asking whether you might be willing to help me change it instead." Elena did not answer immediately, but she did not pull her hand away either, and for the first time since the selection notice had first arrived at her family's door, the fear coiled tight in her chest, loosened by some small but meaningful degree, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to hope. Neither of them knew, as they sat together on that fallen log with the valley spread golden and quiet beneath them, that word of their growing closeness had already begun traveling through carefully chosen ears in the capital, whispered in guest lodgings and council chambers alike, gathering momentum with every retelling. Nor did they know that within the week, a formal complaint would arrive at the palace gates, signed by 3 separate noble families, demanding an official explanation for the king's conduct toward a woman who had deceived the crown and somehow escaped every consequence for it. The quiet mountain idyll they had built together, fragile and new, was about to collide directly with the machinery of a kingdom that had never been designed to accommodate a king's honest heart. The council chamber fell silent the moment Damien entered, though the silence carried none of the respectful stillness he was accustomed to. This was the silence of a room already arguing before he arrived, voices swallowed mid-sentence, expressions rearranged hastily into something more composed than what he had clearly interrupted. "Continue," Damien said, taking his seat at the head of the long stone table. "I would rather hear the argument in full than watch you all pretend it wasn't happening." Lord Fenwick, seated near the far end of the table with 3 other nobles Damien recognized as allies of the Northern Territories, cleared his throat and rose to his feet, a formal letter clutched in one hand. "Your Majesty, 3 noble families have submitted a joint complaint regarding conduct they believe undermines the integrity of the selection. Specifically, reports have reached us of repeated visits paid by yourself to the household of a candidate who was withdrawn from the role under circumstances never fully explained to this council." "The circumstances were explained sufficiently at the time," Damien said evenly. "A private matter, reviewed and resolved. Those exact words were included in the formal notice." "With respect, Your Majesty, private matter explains nothing," Fenwick pressed. "And the visits that have followed since suggest the matter was not so easily resolved as the notice implied. 3 separate reports place you on the Voss family's lands, walking alone, with the young woman in question, on no fewer than 5 occasions in the past several weeks." Murmurs rippled around the table, and Damien felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied moments when his private life threatened to collide with the machinery of governance. He had known this reckoning would come eventually. He had simply hoped for more time before it did. "Am I to understand," he said, keeping his voice carefully level, "that this council believes a king requires formal permission to walk a mountain trail?" "This council believes," said a new voice, one Damien recognized instantly, with a familiar tightening of frustration, "that a king who publicly favors a woman outside the selection process, while thousands of coin have been spent by families across this kingdom preparing daughters for a ceremony you yourself established as the fair and proper method of choosing a queen, owes this council rather more than a dismissive answer about mountain trails." William Draven rose from his seat further down the table, tall and composed, his expression carrying the practiced calm of a man who had waited a long time for exactly this opportunity. He had traveled to the capital under the pretense of attending the selection proceedings on behalf of his territory, but Damien recognized the true purpose glittering behind his carefully measured words. "You have no standing to lecture me on fairness, Draven," Damien said, his voice hardening. "You opposed the unification my father built the moment it threatened your own authority in the north, and you have spent every year since searching for cracks to widen. Do not mistake my patience with your maneuvering for ignorance of it. I am simply raising the concerns of families who have invested considerable resources trusting in the fairness of your selection," Draven said smoothly, unbothered by the accusation. "If your Majesty has already made a private choice outside the formal process, perhaps it would be more honest, and considerably less costly to these families, to simply announce it, and dispense with the selection ceremony entirely." The suggestion landed like a blade across the table, and Damien felt the weight of every eye in the chamber turning toward him, waiting to see how he would respond. He understood exactly what Draven was attempting, to corner him into either publicly denying Elena, which would humiliate her and confirm his own cowardice, or publicly declaring her, which would hand Draven and his allies the exact scandal they needed to paint the crown as unstable and impulsive, unfit to lead a kingdom, still healing from generations of fractured pack rivalries. I have made no formal declaration regarding any candidate, Damien said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of a man walking across thin ice. The selection will proceed as planned, at the appointed time, according to the traditions this council has always upheld. Nothing about my personal conduct outside that ceremony changes the fairness of the process itself. It was, he knew, an answer that satisfied no one fully, least of all himself, but it bought him time, and time was the only currency he had left to work with. The council murmured amongst themselves, some faces still openly skeptical, others willing to accept the deflection for now, and after several more minutes of tense discussion, the matter was tabled rather than resolved, a temporary reprieve rather than a true victory. Damien left the chamber that evening with a headache pounding behind his eyes and a weight settling in his chest that had nothing to do with the formal complaint itself and everything to do with what it meant for Elena. He rode out to the mountain lands that same night, unable to wait for a more appropriate hour, unable to bear the thought of her hearing the rumors secondhand before he had the chance to explain what had happened himself. He found her in the garden despite the late hour, tending to a patch of herbs by lantern light, and the sight of her, so ordinary and unguarded, eased some of the tension coiled in his shoulders even as the weight of what he needed to tell her pressed heavier still. "This is later than even your usual visits," Elena said, straightening from her work with a faint, tired smile that faded quickly once she caught the expression on his face. "What's happened?" Damien told her everything, the formal complaint, Draven's calculated maneuvering, the council's demand for answers he was not yet certain how to give, without endangering either her safety or the fragile stability of the kingdom he had spent 11 years trying to hold together. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression growing steadily more troubled as the full shape of the situation became clear. "They want you to choose," she said finally, when he had finished. "Publicly declare me, and hand your rivals a scandal, or deny me, and prove them right, that none of this ever mattered." "Yes," Damien admitted, "and I refuse to do either. Not until I've found a path that doesn't cost you your safety or dignity in the process." He stepped closer, close enough to see the worry etched clearly across her features in the lantern light. "I need you to understand something, Elena. Whatever happens in that council chamber, whatever rumors spread through the capital in the meantime, this is not me stepping back from what's grown between us. I simply need time to build a case, strong enough that no one can tear it down the moment I make it public." Elena's throat tightened, torn between gratitude for his honesty and fear of everything still standing between them. And if that time never comes? If Draven finds a way to force your hand before you're ready? Damien reached for her hand, holding it steady between both of his own, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then I will face that when it arrives," he said quietly. "But I will not rush you into a declaration you're not ready for, simply to satisfy my council's impatience, and I will not abandon you, simply because the path forward has grown more complicated than I first expected." His voice softened further, carrying a weight of sincerity that settled deep into her chest. "I told you once, I was curious about whether you might one day be brave enough to tell me the truth. You've done that, over and over, more honestly than anyone else in my life ever has. The least I owe you in return is patience. I'll wait, Elena. However long it takes to do this properly, however long it takes for you to feel ready for whatever comes next, I'll wait." The words settled over her like something solid and real, cutting through the fear that had been building steadily since he first began explaining the council's demands. Elena had spent her whole life certain that powerful men took whatever they wanted, without concern for the cost to anyone standing in their way. And yet here stood the most powerful man in the kingdom, promising patience instead of demanding certainty, offering time instead of pressure. "That's a dangerous promise for a king to make," she said softly, though something in her voice had steadied, warmed. "Your enemies won't wait as patiently as you're offering to." "No," Damien agreed, "they won't. Which means we'll simply have to be cleverer than they are." He managed a faint, tired smile, the first real lightness she'd seen from him since he arrived. "I've never much minded a difficult fight, Elena. I've simply never before had something worth fighting quite this hard to protect." Standing together in the lantern-lit garden, with a kingdom's worth of scheming nobles gathering against them somewhere in the darkness beyond the mountain, Elena allowed herself, for just a moment, to believe that his promise might actually be enough to see them through whatever came next. She did not yet know how quickly that promise would be tested, nor how far William Draven and Charlotte Fenwick were prepared to go to ensure it broke before it ever had the chance to be kept. Charlotte Fenwick arrived at the Northern Estate 3 days after the council session, summoned by a message from William Draven that had contained only a single line, "An opportunity, if you're willing to be patient." She found him waiting in his private study, a map of the kingdom's territories spread across his desk, several regions marked with small red pins that told their own quiet story of ambition. "The council meeting went precisely as I hoped," Draven said, without preamble, gesturing for her to sit. "The king refused to make any formal declaration, which means the matter remains unresolved, which means pressure will continue building until something forces his hand." He studied her carefully. "I understand you witnessed the two of them together yourself, on the mountain trail." "I did," Charlotte confirmed. "And I've heard from reliable sources that the visits have continued since, growing more frequent rather than less." Draven's expression sharpened with satisfaction. "Then the king is exactly as sentimental as I hoped he might be. And sentiment, Miss Fenwick, is always the easiest weakness to exploit in a man who otherwise governs with such careful control." He leaned back in his chair, tapping one finger thoughtfully against the desk. "I have a proposal for you, one that would serve both our interests considerably." "I'm listening," Charlotte said. "The selection ceremony proceeds in 6 weeks' time, as scheduled," Draven said. "If, in that time, a credible claim emerged suggesting that you, Miss Fenwick, share a fated bond with the king, a true mating bond, recognized by pack law as superseding any personal preference he might hold, the council would have no choice but to intervene on your behalf, regardless of whatever private attachment he's formed with the Voss girl. Fated bonds are older than selections, older than any king's personal wishes. Even Damien Ashgrave cannot simply dismiss one without unraveling the very traditions his own crown depends upon." Charlotte's brow furrowed. "I share no such bond with him. I've never even properly met the man beyond formal court greetings." "The claim need not survive intense scrutiny for long," Draven said smoothly. "It need only survive long enough to force a public confrontation, one that exposes the king's favoritism toward an unranked pack girl in front of the entire court, one that forces him to either deny you outright, which would raise uncomfortable questions about why a king would reject a claimed bond so quickly and defensively, or accept the scrutiny of a formal bond assessment, which would delay any declaration regarding Miss Voss indefinitely while the matter is investigated." He smiled thinly. "Either outcome serves us well, Miss Fenwick. Either outcome buys considerable time for other arrangements to be made, other pressures to be applied." Charlotte considered the proposal carefully, weighing the risk against the potential reward. A false claim of fated bond was no small matter. Pack law took such assertions seriously, and if exposed as fabricated, the consequences for her family's standing could be severe. But the alternative, watching an unranked healer's daughter potentially rise to a position Charlotte had spent her entire life being groomed for, felt considerably worse. "And if the claim is investigated and found false?" she asked. "It won't be found false quickly," Draven said. "Bond assessments require the involvement of pack elders skilled in such matters, a process that takes weeks, sometimes months, to complete properly. By the time any conclusion is reached, the damage to the king's credibility, and to whatever fragile trust he's built with the Voss girl, will already be done. Trust, once shaken, rarely rebuilds itself as easily as it was first constructed." He met her eyes steadily. "I am not asking you to lie forever, Miss Fenwick. I am asking you to buy time. Time enough for the council's pressure to force the king toward more traditional considerations. Time enough for the Voss girl's resolve to be tested past its breaking point." Charlotte thought of Elena Voss, walking the mountain trail beside the king, laughing at something he'd said, entirely unaware of how closely she was being watched, how quickly the fragile happiness she'd built could be dismantled by those with resources, and patience enough to do it properly. Something cold and determined settled over Charlotte's features. "I'll do it," she said. "But I want assurances, Lord Draven. If this scheme unravels, I want your family's protection guaranteed, regardless of the outcome." "You have my word," Draven said, and though Charlotte was not entirely certain a man like William Draven's word carried the weight he implied, she found herself nodding anyway, already turning the details of the plan over in her mind. The claim was submitted to the palace 3 weeks later, delivered through proper formal channels by Lord Fenwick himself, carrying all the weight and legitimacy that came with a noble family's endorsement. Charlotte Fenwick, it announced, believed herself bound to the king through a fated connection first sensed during a brief formal introduction at a regional gathering the previous spring, a bond she had kept private out of respect for proper selection procedures, until conscience demanded she come forward before the ceremony proceeded any further. Damien received the claim in his private chambers, reading it 3 times over, before setting it aside with barely controlled frustration, immediately recognizing the calculated timing, the strategic precision behind its construction. He had met Charlotte Fenwick exactly once, at the gathering she referenced, for a formal greeting that had lasted less than 2 minutes, and left no impression whatsoever beyond the ordinary courtesies exchanged between a king and a noble daughter. There was no bond. He would have known instantly, the way any alpha recognized the pull of a true fated connection the moment it manifested, unmistakable and undeniable. What existed instead was a fabrication constructed with enough political weight behind it to force exactly the kind of formal investigation Draven and his allies clearly intended. Oliver found him still staring at the claim an hour later, his expression grim. "You suspected this," Oliver said, settling into the chair across from him. "The moment Draven appeared at that council session, you knew he'd find some way to escalate." "I suspected pressure," Damien admitted. "I did not expect a fabricated bond claim, precisely because I didn't think even Draven would risk something so easily disproven under proper investigation." "He's not counting on it being disproven quickly," Oliver said grimly. "He's counting on the investigation itself buying time, forcing delay, forcing you to keep your distance from Miss Voss, while the matter is formally assessed. Every week this drags on is a week Draven can use to whisper doubt into more noble ears, a week for the pressure on you to marry a properly ranked candidate to build further." Damien pressed his palms against his eyes, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. "And if I refuse the assessment outright, dismiss the claim without investigation? Then you hand him precisely the accusation of favoritism he's already trying to build," Oliver said. "A king who refuses to investigate a properly submitted bond claim, choosing instead an unranked candidate, outside proper process entirely. That story writes itself, Damien, and not in your favor." Damien said nothing for a long moment, the weight of the trap settling fully into place around him. Whatever path he chose, Draven had constructed the scheme carefully enough that every option came at significant cost, either to his own credibility or to the fragile, precious thing he had spent weeks carefully building with Elena. And somewhere on that quiet mountain, entirely unaware of the political machinery now turning against her, Elena was likely tending her garden, trusting in a promise he had made without fully understanding, at the time, exactly how difficult keeping it might prove to be. "I need to speak with her," Damien said finally, rising from his chair, "before this news reaches her through rumor, rather than through me directly." "Damien," Oliver said, his voice carrying a warning edge, "be careful how you approach this. If Draven has eyes watching the Voss household, as he clearly has been, any visit you make now will be scrutinized more closely than ever before. One wrong move, one moment that looks like panic or desperation, and you hand them exactly the narrative they're hoping for." Damien paused at the door, his jaw tight with the weight of everything now pressing down around him, a fabricated claim threatening to unravel weeks of careful trust, a rival patiently waiting for exactly this kind of misstep, a promise he had made in a quiet garden that now felt considerably more fragile than it had that night. "I know," he said quietly. "But I made her a promise, Oliver. I intend to keep it, whatever it costs me to do so." He rode out that same evening, choosing the most discreet route he knew, unaware that a rider loyal to Draven had already been positioned along the northern road for exactly this purpose, watching, waiting, ready to carry word of the king's continued visits, straight back to the men working so carefully to end them. Elena knew something was wrong the moment she saw him dismount at the edge of the property, moving with none of the easy warmth that had marked his recent visits, his shoulders set with a tension that carried all the way across the yard. "Tell me," she said simply, before he had even finished crossing the distance between them, foregoing any greeting in favor of the honesty they had built so carefully between them over the past weeks. Damien told her everything, the words coming faster than usual, stripped of his typical careful measure, as though speaking quickly might somehow soften the impact of what he was delivering. The claim, Charlotte Fenwick's name attached to it. Draven's calculated fingerprints all over the timing and construction of the scheme, even if no formal proof yet connected him directly. Elena listened in silence, her expression carefully still, though Damien could see the effort it cost her to maintain that stillness, the way her hands had curled into fists at her sides by the time he finished speaking. "A fated bond," she repeated slowly, testing the words as though they tasted foul. "She's claiming a fated bond with you, based on a 2-minute greeting at some gathering last spring." "Yes," Damien confirmed. "And I have no way to prove the absence of a bond quickly, not to the satisfaction of a formal council investigation. Bond assessments take time, Elena. Weeks, potentially longer, depending on how thoroughly Draven's allies decide to drag out the process." "And during that time," Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "During that time, I will be expected to maintain distance from any other potential attachment," Damien admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. "To do otherwise would appear to prejudge the assessment's outcome, which would hand Draven exactly the accusation of bias he's hoping to build against me." Elena turned away from him, walking a few paces toward the garden fence, her arms wrapped around herself, as though holding something together that threatened to come apart. Damien did not follow immediately, giving her the space he sensed she needed, watching the tension in her shoulders with a helplessness that sat uncomfortably against his usual instinct to solve problems through direct action. "They're trying to erase me," Elena said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Not through any accusation against me directly, through a claim that simply makes me irrelevant. If she truly shares a bond with you, then whatever exists between us becomes nothing more than a king's passing distraction, easily set aside once the true match is confirmed." "There is no bond," Damien said firmly, crossing the distance to stand beside her. "I would know instantly, Elena. A fated connection isn't something that can be faked or overlooked, not by the person meant to experience it. I felt nothing at that gathering beyond ordinary courtesy, and I feel nothing now beyond the certainty that Charlotte Fenwick and William Draven have constructed a lie sturdy enough to buy themselves considerable time." "I believe you," Elena said, and she did, without hesitation, the trust between them solid enough now that doubt did not even occur to her as a possibility. But belief doesn't stop the council from investigating. It doesn't stop the rumors that will spread the moment this claim becomes public knowledge, and it certainly doesn't stop the pressure building for you to abandon whatever's between us in favor of something more politically convenient. Damien reached for her hands, turning her gently to face him. "I told you I would wait," he said. "I meant it then, and I mean it more now than ever. But Elena, I need you to understand what waiting will actually look like in the weeks ahead. It will look like distance, at least publicly. It will look like silence from me while the council conducts its assessment, because any visible attachment on my part will only strengthen Draven's narrative that I've already prejudged the outcome." Elena's throat tightened, understanding settling in with a weight that made her chest ache. "You're saying you can't come here?" "Not while the investigation continues. Not without significant risk to both of us," Damien confirmed, his own voice rough with the difficulty of the admission. "I hate this, Elena. I hate that a fabricated claim can force this kind of distance between us, when nothing about what we've built together has ever been anything but honest. But if I ignore the investigation entirely, if I continue visiting openly while it's underway, I hand Draven's allies exactly the ammunition they need to paint me as reckless, as unfit to govern with the careful judgment this kingdom requires." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither of them wanted to say aloud. Elena had spent weeks slowly lowering the careful walls she'd built around her own heart, trusting a promise made in a lantern-lit garden, and now that promise was already being tested in ways neither of them had anticipated, not by any weakness in their own connection, but by the calculated cruelty of people determined to keep power concentrated exactly where they believed it belonged. "Then we wait," Elena said finally, straightening her shoulders with a resolve that steadied something uncertain in Damien's chest. "Separately, if we must, for now. But Damien, I need you to understand something in return. I did not fake an illness and defy an entire selection ceremony simply to quietly disappear the moment someone with more resources decided I was inconvenient. I will not fight you on this distance, if you believe it's necessary. But I refuse to simply wait passively while Charlotte Fenwick and William Draven construct whatever story serves them best. Something like pride flickered across Damien's expression, despite the weight of the circumstances. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that if they intend to fight this through claims and investigations and careful political maneuvering, then perhaps I should learn to understand those weapons myself, rather than simply waiting on the mountain for the outcome to be decided by everyone except me, Elena said. My father has connections among healers who serve at court, people familiar with how bond assessments are actually conducted. If there's a way to expedite the process, to demonstrate the falseness of this claim more quickly than Draven anticipates, I intend to find it. Damien studied her for a long moment, something warm and fierce settling into his expression, admiration mixed with a protective instinct he had to consciously restrain. That could be dangerous, he said. If Draven realizes you're actively working against his scheme, rather than simply waiting on the sidelines, he may escalate further. Everything about this has been dangerous since the moment you walked into my bedroom and caught me failing to fake a proper cough, Elena said, a faint, determined smile touching her lips despite the tension of the conversation. I would rather face that danger, doing something, than face it doing nothing at all. Damien could not help the small, genuine laugh that escaped him, some of the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since he'd arrived. I seem to recall specifically warning you that a girl faking illness should remember to cough, he said. You've held that against me for weeks now. I intend to hold it against you for considerably longer, Elena said, though her voice had softened, warmth returning, to replace some of the earlier fear. Damien reached up, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his expression turning serious once more. Whatever comes next, Elena, know that this distance is temporary, and it changes nothing about what I feel. I will find a way through this investigation as quickly as honesty allows, and when it's finished, when Draven's lie has been exposed for exactly what it is, I intend to make certain the entire kingdom understands precisely how much you matter to me. I'll hold you to that too, Elena said softly. They parted that evening with considerably more caution than their previous farewells, aware that eyes hidden somewhere in the surrounding trees might already be watching, cataloging this final visit before the enforced distance began. Neither of them could have known, as Damien rode back toward the capital under cover of deepening darkness, that the rider who had tracked his movements along the northern road had already carried word of tonight's visit straight back to William Draven, arriving at the northern estate before the moon had even fully risen. Nor could they have known that Draven, upon receiving the report, would immediately begin planning something considerably more aggressive than a fabricated bond claim, something designed not merely to delay Damien's declaration, but to threaten the one thing Elena valued most in the world, beyond the growing connection she shared with the king, the safety and standing of her own family. The knock at the cottage door came at midday, official and formal, delivered by a pair of guards Elena did not recognize, wearing colors that marked them as serving under regional authority, rather than the crown directly. Edward answered, his expression shifting quickly from confusion to alarm, as one of the guards unrolled a formal notice and began reading aloud in a flat, practiced voice. Edward Voss, healer of this pack, you are hereby summoned to appear before the regional council to answer accusations of improper medical practice, specifically, the deliberate misuse of herbal preparations, to falsify illness in a manner that deceived official crown correspondents. Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The accusation was not subtle. It was not even particularly clever in truth, simply a direct and calculated strike, aimed exactly where it would hurt most, not at Elena herself, whose defiance had already proven difficult to leverage, but at her father, whose entire livelihood and reputation depended on the trust of a community that relied on his medical judgment. This is absurd, Margaret said, rushing forward, her voice sharp with fear and fury in equal measure. Edward has served this pack faithfully for 30 years. He has never once misused his craft. The accusation has been formally submitted and must be formally addressed, the guard said, unmoved by her protest. Failure to appear before the council within 7 days will result in immediate suspension of healing privileges and possible further action. The guards departed as efficiently as they had arrived, leaving the small cottage in stunned, furious silence. Elena stared at the door long after it had closed, understanding with sick clarity exactly what this accusation represented, and exactly who stood behind it, even without any name attached to the formal charge. "This is because of me," she said quietly. "Because of Damien. Because whoever is trying to stop this from continuing has run out of patience waiting for a bond investigation to work slowly enough." "Elena." Her father's voice was steady, despite the visible tension in his frame. "Whatever the reason, this accusation threatens my ability to practice, my standing in this community, everything I've built over 30 years of service. We cannot simply dismiss it as political maneuvering, no matter how convinced we are of its true origin." Elena felt fury rising in her chest, hot and clarifying, burning away the fear that had lingered since Damien's last visit. She had told him she refused to wait passively, while others decided her fate, and now that resolve hardened into something considerably sharper, considerably more determined. "Then we fight it," she said, "properly, publicly, with evidence rather than simply protesting the injustice of it. Papa, you've kept records of every preparation you've ever administered, every patient you've treated. If this accusation claims you falsified illness for deceptive purposes, we prove exactly what tonic you gave me, and why, and we prove it was never intended to deceive the Crown, regarding any matter beyond a young woman's reasonable wish to avoid an unwanted ceremony." "That would mean admitting publicly what we did," Margaret said carefully, "confirming the very deception this whole affair began with." "Yes," Elena said, "but better to admit a small, understandable deception on our own terms than to let Draven's allies construct a far more damaging version of events through a fabricated accusation of medical malpractice." She looked between her parents, steadying her voice with a resolve she drew from somewhere deep and unfamiliar. "I started this. I'm the one who asked Papa for help avoiding the selection. If there's a price to be paid for that choice, I refuse to let him pay it alone, while I remain safely hidden behind the excuse of protecting my own reputation." Word reached Damien within hours, carried by a rider Elena's father trusted enough to send directly to the capital despite the risk involved. Damien read the account of the accusation with a fury that surprised even Oliver, who had rarely seen his friend's careful composure crack so visibly. "This has gone too far," Damien said, pacing the length of his private study with barely restrained anger. "Threatening a healer's livelihood, a man who has served his community faithfully for decades, simply to apply pressure through his daughter. This is not politics, Oliver. This is cruelty, dressed in official language." "Which is precisely why you cannot respond to it with anger alone," Oliver cautioned. "If you intervene directly, publicly, on Edward Voss's behalf before the regional council even convenes, you hand Draven exactly the proof he needs, that your judgment regarding this family has already been thoroughly compromised. You need evidence, Damien, not fury. Evidence that exposes both this accusation and the fabricated bond claim as connected pieces of the same coordinated scheme." Damien forced himself to stop pacing, drawing on years of careful discipline to push past the anger towards something more useful. "Then we find that evidence," he said, quickly. "Edward Voss has 7 days before he must appear. I intend to make certain that when he does, the true architects of this accusation stand exposed before the entire council." The following days passed in a blur of careful, urgent work on both sides of the widening conflict. Elena, drawing on her own knowledge of healing and her father's meticulous records, prepared a detailed account of the tonic administered, cross-referenced against established medical texts that confirmed its legitimate use for inducing mild sweats in patients recovering from minor chills, hardly the dangerous deception the accusation implied. Meanwhile, in the capital, Oliver worked through his own network of court contacts, quietly tracing the formal accusation back through the regional council's paperwork, until a pattern emerged that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The guard who had delivered the accusation, it turned out, served not under any regional authority independently, but under a commission recently funded through a series of payments traced back to Lord Fenwick's estate. Combined with Charlotte Fenwick's earlier bond claim, the connection painted a picture too clear to ignore. 2 separate schemes working in careful, deliberate coordination to isolate and discredit Elena and her family through whatever means proved most effective. On the 7th day, Edward Voss stood before the regional council with his daughter at his side, prepared to answer accusations that had, in truth, never been about medical malpractice at all. What none of them expected, as the proceedings began, was for the chamber doors to open partway through, and for King Damien Ashgrave himself to enter. unannounced, accompanied by Oliver Kane, carrying a folder of documents that would change the course of the entire proceeding. "I believe," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent chamber, "that before this council continues judging a healer's professional conduct, it deserves to understand exactly who commissioned this accusation, and why." The chamber erupted into murmurs the moment Damien's words settled over the room. Council members exchanging startled glances, Lord Fenwick rising halfway from his seat, before catching himself, and sinking back down, with visible effort to appear unbothered. "Your Majesty," said the presiding council elder. An older woman named Charlotte's father had clearly not accounted for in his calculations. "This proceeding concerns a formal accusation against Edward Voss. If you have information relevant to the matter, the council will hear it." Damien nodded to Oliver, who stepped forward and began laying documents across the presiding table with careful precision. Records of payment, traced from Lord Fenwick's estate to the commissioning authority behind the accusation. Correspondence between regional officials that revealed the charge had been rushed through improper channels without the standard review such serious accusations typically required. And finally, most damning of all, a dated letter establishing that the commission had been paid for and finalized only 2 days after Damien's most recent visit to the Voss household. A timeline that made the true motivation behind the accusation impossible to credibly dispute. "This accusation," Damien said, addressing the full council now, his voice carrying the calm, controlled authority Elena had come to associate with him at his most formidable, was never truly about Edward Voss's medical conduct. It was constructed and funded to punish a family for my own choice to visit their household, timed specifically to apply pressure during an ongoing bond assessment that Lord Fenwick's own daughter initiated against me less than a month ago. The chamber fell into stunned silence, and Elena, standing beside her father, felt something fierce and vindicated rise in her chest as she watched Lord Fenwick's careful composure begin to crack under the weight of documented proof. "This is a serious accusation, Your Majesty," the presiding elder said carefully. "One that implicates a noble family in coordinated deception against the crown's own healer." "It is," Damien agreed, "and I would not make it without evidence sufficient to withstand the same scrutiny this council was prepared to apply to Edward Voss." He turned toward Lord Fenwick directly. "Would you care to explain the payment records connecting your estate to this commission, or shall we proceed to examine your daughter's bond claim with the same rigor?" Lord Fenwick's face had drained of color, and for a long, tense moment, the chamber waited to see whether he would attempt further denial. But the evidence Oliver had gathered was too precise, too thoroughly documented, and after a strained silence, Fenwick's shoulders sagged with the particular defeat of a man who understood he had been caught beyond any possibility of graceful escape. "I acted alone in commissioning the accusation against the healer," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, though whether at himself or at being caught, Elena could not tell. "Lord Draven suggested the strategy regarding my daughter's claim, but the decision to escalate through the healer's professional standing was my own, made out of frustration at the slow pace of the formal bond investigation." The mention of Draven's name sent a fresh ripple of murmurs through the chamber, and Elena watched several council members' expressions shift, calculating what this new revelation meant for the Northern Alpha's carefully cultivated reputation among the more traditional pack elders. "Then let us also examine the bond claim itself," Damien said, "since its foundation now appears considerably less solid than initially presented." He gestured, and a healer trained specifically in bond assessment, summoned quietly by Oliver in the preceding days, stepped forward from where she had been waiting near the chamber entrance. The formal assessment that followed was brief and unambiguous. Charlotte Fenwick, called before the council to submit to proper examination, found herself unable to produce any of the physical or sensory markers that accompanied a genuine fated connection. No elevated pulse in the king's presence beyond ordinary nervousness. No recognition response from Damien himself. None of the subtle but unmistakable signs, the trained healer confirmed, should have been present in even the earliest stages of a true bond. Under careful, formal questioning, Charlotte's composure finally broke entirely, and she admitted, in a voice shaking with the weight of exposure, that the claim had been fabricated at her father's urging, constructed with Lord Draven's guidance, to delay and undermine the king's growing attachment to Elena Voss. The chamber that had begun the proceeding prepared to judge a healer's professional conduct now found itself instead witnessing the complete unraveling of a scheme two powerful noble houses had spent weeks carefully constructing, and by the time the presiding elder finally called the session to order once more, the entire complexion of the proceeding had transformed beyond recognition. Given the evidence presented, the elder said gravely, this council finds the accusation against Edward Voss to be without merit, constructed under false pretenses for political purposes, unrelated to any genuine concern regarding his medical practice. The accusation is formally dismissed, and the council will separately address the conduct of Lord Fenwick and Lord Draven, whose actions in this matter warrant serious further review. Relief flooded through Elena so powerfully that she felt her legs nearly give beneath her, and beside her, she heard her father exhale a long breath he seemed to have been holding for the entirety of the proceeding. Margaret, seated in the gallery, pressed a hand to her mouth, tears of relief and fury, both bright in her eyes. Damien crossed the chamber toward them the moment the formal proceeding concluded, and for the first time since the accusation had first arrived, Elena watched something in his expression fully unguard itself, relief and fierce protectiveness mingling openly on his face without any concern for who might be watching. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for her, despite the crowded chamber around them. "I am now," Elena said, and found she meant it completely, the fear of the past week finally beginning to loosen its grip on her chest. Around them, the council chamber buzzed with the aftermath of the day's revelations, nobles and elders alike processing the sudden, dramatic collapse of a scheme that had, until moments ago, seemed poised to reshape the entire political landscape of the selection. Word would spread quickly from this chamber, Elena knew, carrying the truth of what had happened to every corner of the kingdom far faster than any of Draven's earlier whispered rumors had managed. "There is still the matter of the selection ceremony itself," Damien said quietly, once the immediate chaos of the chamber had begun to settle. "It proceeds in 3 weeks' time, as scheduled, and my council will expect a formal declaration from me before it concludes, regardless of everything that's happened here today." Elena understood immediately what he was truly asking, even though he had not phrased it as a question. The distance the past weeks had forced between them, the careful public restraint, the fear and uncertainty that had colored every interaction since the fabricated claims first surfaced. All of it had been building toward this single moment, and Elena found, to her own quiet surprise, that she no longer felt any hesitation about what she wanted her answer to be. "Then let it proceed," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "And let whatever declaration you intend to make it there, in front of everyone. I spent weeks hiding from a ceremony I feared would strip away my choice entirely. I find I would rather stand in the middle of it now and make my own choice in front of the whole kingdom than continue hiding from something that no longer frightens me the way it once did." Something warm and fierce lit Damien's expression at her words, admiration and love mingling openly, in a way he had rarely allowed himself in public before. "Are you certain?" he asked. "There will be no more hiding after that, Elena. No more quiet mountain visits away from watching eyes. Whatever we build from that point forward, we build in full view of a kingdom that will have opinions about every part of it." "I've had enough of hiding," Elena said simply. "I would rather build something honest in full view than continue protecting something fragile in the shadows. I think I've earned that much, after everything this past month has cost us both." 3 weeks later, the selection ceremony proceeded exactly as tradition demanded. The great hall filled with candidates from every corner of the kingdom, each dressed in her finest, each hoping to catch the king's eye through careful performance and practiced grace. Elena stood among them, not as an official candidate, but as an invited guest, at Damien's specific request, dressed simply, compared to the elaborate gowns surrounding her, drawing curious glances from nobles who had heard whispered fragments of the scandal that had rocked the court weeks earlier, but understood little of the full truth behind it. When Damien rose from his throne partway through the ceremony, the hall fell silent in anticipation, every candidate straightening with hope that this might be the moment their own name was called. Instead, Damien's gaze moved past the assembled rows entirely, settling on Elena where she stood near the edge of the hall, and he extended a hand toward her, in an invitation that required no words to understand. "3 months ago," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed chamber, as Elena crossed the hall to stand beside him, her heart hammering with a mixture of nerves and certainty she had never expected to feel in equal measure. "I rode to a healer's cottage expecting to find a young woman too ill to attend this selection. What I found instead was a woman brave enough to lie to a king's face, and honest enough to explain exactly why she'd done it the moment I asked. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, but Damien continued, undeterred, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. Since then, this kingdom has watched a coordinated attempt to force distance between us, to fabricate claims and accusations designed to protect a tradition that has, for generations, valued performance over honesty, obligation over genuine choice. I could have declared my intentions weeks ago, when the pressure first began building. I chose instead to wait, because I promised Elena Voss that whatever came next would be her choice as much as mine, never simply mine alone. He turned fully toward her now, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath collectively as he continued. I am not asking this council, or this kingdom, to simply accept a decision already made in private, Damien said. I am asking Elena, here, in front of everyone who has ever doubted whether this connection was genuine, whether she chooses this, whether she chooses me, not out of any pressure or obligation, but because it's what she actually wants. Elena felt every eye in the hall settle on her, felt the weight of tradition and expectation pressing in from every direction, and found, beneath all of it, that her answer had never once been in doubt, not since a lantern-lit garden weeks earlier, when a king had promised to wait rather than demand. I choose you, she said, her voice steady and clear enough to carry across the silent hall. Not because of any selection, and not because of any bond, declared by tradition, rather than felt honestly. I choose you because you asked me what I wanted, instead of simply deciding for me. Because you waited when waiting cost you politically. And because everything real between us was built in honesty, rather than performance. She smiled, something bright and certain settling over her features. I faked an illness to avoid a ceremony I believed would strip away my choice entirely. I never expected that ceremony would end with me making the most important choice of my life freely, in front of everyone, with absolutely no fear left in me at all. The hall erupted into a mixture of applause and startled murmurs, the assembled candidates and nobles processing the dramatic conclusion to a selection unlike any the kingdom had witnessed in generations. Somewhere near the back of the hall, Elena caught sight of Charlotte Fenwick's stiff, unreadable expression, and further still, empty space, where William Draven should have stood. His absence from the ceremony, entirely its own quiet confirmation of how thoroughly his scheme had collapsed beneath its own weight. Damien reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in front of the entire watching court, and when he leaned close enough that only she could hear him, his voice carried all the warmth and certainty that had first drawn her to him in that quiet cottage bedroom months earlier. Thank you for choosing honestly, he said softly, even when honesty was the harder path. Thank you for waiting, Elena replied, even when waiting cost you everything easier. Outside the great hall, the mountain wind carried the sound of celebration bells ringing across the capital, spreading word of a selection that had ended not with a king's decree, but with a healer's daughter's free and honest choice, a story that would be told across the kingdom for years to come, not as a tale of a king who claimed what he wanted, but as one of a man patient enough to wait until the woman he loved was ready to claim him in return.